Have the slides ready momentarily. And everybody see them?
There we go.
Right. So Dr. Sens, whenever you're ready, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And thanks very much for coming to listen to this. We'll talk about some scoring on NIH grants, mostly the R-type grants, which are the R01s, the R21s, the R03s. And there's not too much mystery to the scoring NIH grants, but we'll go over it just in case you've never had them scored before or you don't know quite what to do with the score when you get it. So any questions, you can either hold them to the end or you can shout out to Christian as we go along. I don't mind either way. So my first slide. So what we'll try to do is I want to go over the sections that are scored by reviewers when you send your grant in, the number of reviewers that you'll have per your application and how they interact with the study section. The range for scores, the overall impact and the range of those scores, something called outer range scoring, which is a little bit important, and what happens when you get triage, which means your grant doesn't get reviewed, and how you can resubmit your grants. So we'll follow all of those and try to cover each topic. So next slide, please. So when you submit your grant, you're going to have 5 sections that are going to get scored. One of these is the significance, and this will be in your research strategy. Your biosketch is very important. They keep changing it, which drives us all nuts, but they keep doing it. But your personal statement's important to outline why you're doing what you do and your accomplishments that you've had during your career. So your biosketch is really important. A lot of people will go and look at your biosketch as the first thing they do with your grant to see, you know, who they're dealing with and how productive they've been and what their areas of expertise are. So your biosketch is really important as one of the first steps. The other scored thing will be your innovation. It's usually a fairly short, maybe a paragraph, not much more than that, but why your research strategy is special, why it's unique, and why it will lead to a new paradigm. The approach is where most people, when they review, actually take a lot of time, and that's your research strategy of how you're going to do it. And normally it'll have a specific aim, a short background, your strategy. Then two other things are really important. You'll have a section on expected results. And an important part of this is then to have a section on what you do if it doesn't work. Okay. And a lot of people will call this pitfalls and alternatives. So, you know, you really don't want to put down that, you know, I'm so perfect that nothing can go wrong. That doesn't go over real well. But so, you know, spend some time on what you're going to do if your experiments don't work. Your environment, unless something's really out of line, people don't pay too much attention to it. Your facility statement earlier in the grant's important, but other than that, the significance, your investigator, your innovation and approach are going to really drive a lot of the enthusiasm or lack of enthusiasm for the grant. So next, please. So they're going to score your significance, your investigators, your innovation, your approach, your environment. And you'll get criterion scores on these, which I'll go over here in a minute. And these are the ones that will affect your overall impact score. So at the end of the review, you'll get an impact score, which is going to be used to put you in a certain category with a possibility for funding. There's a couple other additional review criteria. 2 of them are really important. Your human subjects, your vertebrate animals. If there's anything wrong with it, it can affect the score. Most people aren't too usually critical of it, but they'll ask for an administrative note on it. So the administrators at NIH look at your human subject and your animals, and if it's unacceptable until you get it fixed, even if you've got a fundable score, they will not fund your grant. Okay, so those two have to be perfect and meet all the expectations that are required in those sections. Study timeline, that's only for clinical trials. Inclusion, again, pretty much for your human subjects on how you're going to get all types of people and have a good population so that everybody's included. Okay, then there's some others on there, foreign institutions, that none of these are scored. And you have to give special consideration if you have a foreign institution. You have to show why you can't get that expertise in the United States. Select agents, resource sharing, authentication of key resources is a sort of a new area where they want you to present your key resources and why you know they're going to be good. Okay. And what they're trying to do is stop bad antibodies or other bad reagents from getting into the review process. Next slide. So what they'll have is an impact score. And this will be the overall evaluation of your grant. And high impact is a score of 1, 2, or 3. And 1's exceptional, 2's outstanding, 3's excellent. Then you get into moderate impact of 4, 5, and 6, which is very good, good, satisfactory. And then you get into low impact, 7, 8, and 9, which is a fair, marginal, or a poor impact of the study. And very few grants get down into the low impact category. Most grants that are submitted have some kind of at least a moderate impact that they would have if they are completed, but they very seldom fall into fair, marginal, or poor. The NIH would like people to use that designation more, but and when we go over what each one means, you'll sort of see why. So there's some non-numerical score options that really I don't think we need to discuss here. You won't run into them on your R01 applications or your R applications. But as your impact is high, you'll have high strengths. And as the impact is lowered, more and more weaknesses show up in the grant and less strengths. Next slide, please. So a grant that is exceptional is very strong and it has no weaknesses whatsoever. You don't see too many 1s given by study section reviewers because if they give a 1, they really can't talk about any weaknesses of that grant, or another study section member will actually usually challenge that and say, you've had 3 or 4 weaknesses, how can you give it, exceptional? Outstanding, extremely strong, a few negligible weaknesses. Excellent, very strong again with some minor weaknesses. So in that first high category, pretty much you're into a situation where you're only looking at minor weaknesses to actually lower that score. You go into the medium, you still have very strong with some minor weaknesses. Very good, you still strong with some numerous minor weaknesses. And you get down to satisfactory, you're losing some strengths, but you're also getting some moderate weaknesses. And once moderate weaknesses start showing up, your score is going to start going down into the 5 or 6 range, at least a 4 range. And fair, marginal, and poor, strengths are getting pretty limited, and you're getting more and more major weaknesses. Now, a minor weakness is defined by the NIH, and what we'd be briefed on before we review your grant is it's an easy addressable weakness that does not substantially lessen impact. And that minor weakness definition pretty much keeps everything in that 1, 2, or 3 area. Minor weaknesses should not really lower your grant into 4s, 5s, and 6s unless you have a lot of them. Moderate weakness is one that lessens impact, and a major weakness severely limits impact. So if there's a number of major weaknesses in a grant that are identified during your review, your scores you would think might fall into the low range, but they'll probably stay somewhere in the medium range. The study sections very seldom like to use the 7, 8, and 9 scores. And that's just the way the study sections, the people on them view things. NIH tries to get people to use the lower scores, but they really hardly ever do. So most of your grants, if they don't like them or they're not going to have they're difficulty with funding, it's going to be in the 4, 5, and 6 range. Okay, so next slide. Okay, criteria scores and overall impact scores. So when your grant is scored by an individual reviewer, and that'll be the ones assigned to your grant, there's usually 3 of them. They will score your significance, your innovation, your investigator, your approach, and your environment on a 1 to 9 scale, best to worst. And these are detailed on your grant summary statement, okay? They are not brought up during the review of the grant, those individual scores. Those are from your primary and secondary and tertiary reviewers, and they tell you what each reviewer thought of all of those 5 sections. But they do not come up to the table on the review of the application. And these criteria scores, when you see them on your study section summary, they're not, your impact score is not an average of those. So what people get confused about is they'll look at their criteria scores, you know, add the numbers up, divide it by 5, and say, well, gee, you know, I should have got a 2.5 on this application. And it doesn't work like that. So you could have 4 really good criteria scores, 1 terrible one, and the one that's the bad one might actually dominate the whole review. Okay, so they're not used for study section review, but they're really important because they provide you insight on what you would need if you want to resubmit the grant. Okay, so if the first grant you submit, a new one, is not funded, you're allowed 1 resubmission of that grant, and you're allowed a 1-page before introduction to say how you fixed that grant, or say how they misinterpreted or how you didn't make something clear. It's a very important page, okay, but you're only allowed one resubmission. And it gets really important because scores on a resubmission normally get better. And I'll go over some data on that. So your criteria scores, they're for you, is, you know, if you see 3 reviewers and they all say, gee, you know, the innovation of this grant isn't clear, and all 3 of them have pointed it out, you can pretty well bet you didn't make it clear. Sometimes there'll be different ones from each that the comments don't add up maybe, but normally when you're going to revise that grant, you really want those criteria scores. They're really important. Okay, so overall impact score is not an average of those, okay? And it's something when new investigators first get their scores back on NIH and see their study section summaries, they'll see those scores and want to add them up and divide them and say, why doesn't this make sense? And it's not what they're really for. It helps the reviewers and it helps the person understand how their grant was looked on by the reviewers of it. So then you're given an overall impact score. And that's just what these reviewers think the impact of your study is. It's also a 1 to 9 scale. And it's totally separate from those criteria scores, but this is what is going to drive the fundability of your grant, is going to be overall impact. Okay, so next slide, please. So what you're going to have happen during this review, normally you'll get 3 scientific reviewers assigned to your application. And those 3 reviewers will be called upon right at the start of the grant review for your grant for their preliminary impact scores. So those reviewers may give it a 2, a 4, and a 5. So each one gives their impact. Then your primary reviewer actually gives an introduction to the application, summarizes his or her strengths and weaknesses of the application, and essentially presents this application in line with that impact score on major weaknesses, minor weaknesses, strengths, gives a good overall view of the application. The second reviewer is usually, if he or she has additional strengths, they'll bring them up, or if they have additional weaknesses that weren't in the primary one, they will cover those. And then you'll move to your third reviewer, and pretty much the third reviewer doesn't spend usually quite as much time on the grant, even though they're supposed to. But again, they'll be pretty much only adding strengths or weaknesses they saw that the first or the second reviewer didn't see. So by this time, you know, you've had a good review of that grant on what people think its strengths are, what people think its weaknesses are. Then the chair of that study section opens it up for discussion by everybody on that study section. And they're able to ask the reviewers questions, to, you know, either say, why do you really think that was a strength, or why do you think that was a weakness, or this sounds like a lot of weaknesses for your preliminary score you gave. It'll be a pretty open discussion, and pretty much it can go on for a long time, or it can be very short. It just depends on how the whole study section looked at those 3 reviewers that reviewed your grant. And if they thought, you know, they were in agreement and everything was strong, usually the study section discussion will be short. Occasionally you'll have reviewers that are split, where one thinks it's fantastic and one doesn't think it's so good. And then the study section discussion becomes really important, because the study section is going to want to know, can it go one way or another, or is just one everybody's going to, what we call, vote their conscience on, where you can't come to a summary that everybody agrees on. So once that occurs, the chair will say, okay, we want the final recommended impact score from the 3 reviewers. And these 3 reviewers are able to change their impact scores from what they gave preliminary. And they'll give their scores. And then what happens is, next slide, please. It goes to the entire study section. And what happens then is sort of interesting, is those impact scores from those 3 reviewers will have a range or no range. If everybody gives it a 1, it's got a range of 1. But if somebody's out of range, you've got to identify why. So if you had your first, second, and third reviewer score the grant a 1, a 2, and a 3 respectively, everybody else on that study section is either has to stay within that range of 1 to 3, or if they are going to go to a different score, then they have to tell the study section, the SRO, which is the person from NIH that keeps track of everything for the study section, they have to state a reason and give a written explanation. And that's so things don't show up in a summary statement that don't make any sense because somebody made some criticisms that weren't present in a lot of the other reviews. And The SRO writes a summary of the study section discussion. Okay, so right at the top of your summary statement, you'll actually get an overall view of what the SRO heard as a discussion of your application. So if you hear somebody talk about outer range, it's just when somebody doesn't agree with the scores those first reviewers gave and they choose to give it a different score. It's very rare. Usually everything stays in range, but every once in a while this will happen. Okay, next slide, please. So that final impact score, each member of that study section will give that final impact score. They take the average of that score, take it times 10, and you get a score of 10 to 90, okay? And 10 is your best, 90 is your worst. Follows the same strength and weakness criteria that we went over in the first slides, okay? And that score is really important on how your grant did, but it will be converted into a percentile if there's sufficient applications. So you will see an impact score and you will see a percentile score for that application. And what that percentile score is, next slide, please. So in a standing study section, and that means one that meets 3 times a year and covers the same type of grant area, is they're given a percentile score. So for an R01 that you normally send in that's unsolicited, you just decided you wanted to put it in as a grant, they take your overall impact score and they turn it into a percentile. And a percentile just ranks your application relative to other applications by your study section at its last 3 meetings. And what this does is it gets a percentile and it evens out differences in the study section from one meeting to the next. So if one meeting it was a very easy study section and everybody scored really, really well, and another study section, there had been some change in the people on the section, and all of a sudden it was a much harder study section in terms of scoring. It evens those out, okay? And for the standing study sections that meet like this, is those percentiles are what the NI uses for deciding what the pay line is, or where they're going to fund a grant, or where they're going to cut off funding of grants. So the percentile becomes really important in this, as well as your preliminary scores. Now, and I don't know if people know what an RFA is. So these are unsolicited, okay? So anybody is free to send these into the study section. Every once in a while, the NIH, because it wants to get information on an important area, that they'll actually go after a special funding announcement. And these are called requests for applications. And they don't go to a regular standing study section. They make their own study section to review these. So a good example of this was COVID, is they've taken grants and targeted them through requests for applications to study different aspects of COVID. And what happens on these is your impact score is the only score you're going to get. There's not enough other study sections because these are one at a time opportunities. They don't occur multiple times. So there's no percentile. So on your RFA, your impact score is going to rule the day for all this. And RFAs are really, really nice. I've been funded by a lot of them. I prefer them actually. But they're a one-time offering, and it's one and done. If you get a really, really great score that just misses funding, there's nothing you can do about it. There's not a resubmission project on this so easily. Okay, next slide. Okay, not discussed. This is something you're going to run into, and it's not pleasant. So to speed up the study section review, And whether you agree with it or don't agree with it, the NIH went to it. So the NIH will take all the applications that are reviewed, and they'll take the impact scores or the impact scores, and they'll line them up, and they'll only discuss the 50 best grants. Okay. And the ones that don't get discussed, the ones that didn't fall into the first 50th percentile, they still get a summary statement. There's no review of their grant, but you get the summary statement, you get the criteria scores, and you get the review that each of the 3 reviewers would have given to that grant had it gone to the table. So you still get some information back, but your grant's not discussed by the study section. So it has no score. It's just an ND, not discussed. Okay. And pretty much is, as scores have gone down, I mean, grants are pretty good, is a grant in the 4 or 5 impact range is now liable to get triaged out. So grants with really minor weaknesses and maybe only a 1 moderate weakness now cannot be discussed in a study section. But it's what it is, but you still get a review back that tells you essentially why it was scored the way it was scored by the 3 primary reviewers. Next slide, please. So the reason this is important, it's not discussed, is this is some data from 2012 to 2016. The data really hasn't changed even till now. I couldn't find anything that's been done since then. If I thought it would be out there, but I think maybe because it just hasn't changed. So there's 2 types of R01 awards. Type 1 is a brand new grant, never been reviewed before. A type 2 is a grant that was funded and is now in for what we call a competing renewal. So what they're asking on a type 2 grant is to take my first 5-year grant and give it another 5 years. Okay, so type 1, type 2. And what will happen to these is your award rates, as you would expect, they fall between your impact scores of 10 to 30. A lot of those grants will be funded. New ones, it'll be 60-some%. I think it's a little lower now. And renewals do a little bit better. What you see is a drastic fall off when you go to 31 to 40. And pretty much after an impact score of 40, nothing good's going to happen to your grant in terms of funding. And 51 to 90 is really not used anymore. It would just not be discussed. Okay. And the reason this is important is if you have a grant that's a new one and it falls, say, from 40 on to non-discussed, you can submit it 1 more time, but only 1 more time. And what happens, the question comes up, are you better off not resubmitting it and just going in with a new grant, hoping to get in this 31 to 40 or 10 to 30 range where you got a really good chance on a resubmission? And the dogma is if you write a good introduction on your resubmission, you will get a better score than you got before. Okay, so you get 1 chance to improve this. Whoops, I'm trying to do my own slides. Next slide, please. So resubmission rates, people that are scoring down in the 1 to 10 to 30, 31 to 40, they're resubmitting quite a bit. It starts falling off as the scores get worse and down to the non-discussed. So, you know, is when you get to this, and it varies from person to person. I've been taught that if it's not discussed, is write a new grant, hope to get a numerical score, and then on resubmission, you know, try to make it better and get down into that 10 to 20 range. Other people will say, hey, they didn't score it, but go ahead and give it a try the second time. It just depends what your philosophy is. It depends how your mentors view things. But for my personal experience, I don't resubmit non-discussed. I just write a new grant, change a specific aim somewhat, and send it in as a new grant. Hope to get into this range of 10 to 40 where I can resubmit and maybe gain 20 points down to a 10 or a 20. Okay, so it's an important issue, and you just got to use your own judgment on it. And as I say, some people that are experienced on submitting grants will say, hey, go for it when it's not discussed, try to fix it. And my training has been to just put in a new one, hope to get a better score so I could get it better on resubmission. Next slide, please. So the funding rate, award rates, when you do this and you're in this range, the award rates between either a new one or a resubmission getting funded gets pretty good. It gets pretty high if you're into this 10 to 30 range. And 31 to 40 falls off really fast. R21s still stay pretty viable in the 31 to 40 range. R01s have a little tougher time there. R03s, if they are also pretty good in that range. But here in the later parts, 41 to 50 and not discussed, they're usually eventually not going to get awarded. But a few non-discussed will fix themselves, especially sometimes on a resubmission, maybe looks like about 10%. But you got to remember, you only get one resubmission. You don't get to resubmit another one. And what you lose on your not being able to resubmit a third time or a second time is you lose that introduction and the ability to show that you fixed what they thought was wrong before. So it's important on resubmissions to try to improve your score. And it gives you a much better chance of getting a grant if you're resubmitting where you already have a pretty good score from the study section. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is a picture of your ERA Commons. If you don't know what it is, you need to find out. So this is how the NIH communicates with you on your grant to a great extent, is you have a Commons account. It's made by your research office and you can go into it, you set a password. Now you set your password plus they need another one. So they have double identification. So you have a password to get in, then you have a email that comes from the NIH that you've got to submit that gives you the second part of your verification so you can get in to your account. And for your grant, you'll want to go to something called status, and it'll take you to a place where your grants are listed, and you can pop up that grant. You can find your application. So if you ever need a copy of it, it's there. You can find your summary of your study sections. You can find your notice of grant award if things were funded. If you've got supplements pending, in other words, if they put out supplements for the grant where you could compete for special topics, those will be listed. So it's where all the data for your grant is really located. It's where your progress reports go. It's something you really need to be able to work with. Assist is really the system that helps you actually submit your grants. Personal profile, sort of important, especially if you're a new or a young investigator, because it sort of keeps track of those type of things. And if you get on a study section, it's where everything to do with the review shows up. Okay, your scoring, everything. So if you're not familiar with your Commons, get with an experienced investigator and have them just maneuver through some of their grants and some of their study sections disappear after they're over. But if they ever have an active study section, they can at least show you how to get into it and what the first page looks like. They can't show you anything else for confidentiality. But know your ERA comments. And if you don't know it, just grab somebody that's used to getting grants and used to submitting grants, and they can take you right through it. Okay. But it's where you really get a lot of information. Okay, I think one more slide. Okay. And I can't stress this enough, is if you're an early stage investigator, you have to use this opportunity, okay? And this is within 10 years of completed their terminal research degree or their postgraduate clinical training. You can call the NIH a program officer, and they can tell you whether you qualify or not. And you really get a break on what is funded if you're an early stage investigator. Okay. I've been on the study sections where just because of the lay of the land, there was only like one early investigator. And as long as I don't name the study section, I think I'm okay. I've seen them go into the 40s and high 40s range to fund an investigator for their first grant. So don't waste the opportunity of being an early stage investigator, and know what disqualifies you. Okay. So before you go on something as a multiple PI or something like this, call up the NIH and make sure you're not losing that status, because this is going to be the one chance you really get to get your first R01 award. Okay. And you don't want to lose that 10-year window if you can avoid it, because it really, really does help. And if you happen to be a, what's my word? Oh, I hate it when that happens, a senior moment. An individual who is say first generation, a Native American in a tribal college environment, anything that's a underserved population, these get even easier to get your first R01. So there's a big effort by the NIH to get underserved populations funded as PIs, because there's a shortage of PIs for this. So diversity becomes important in this, and you can even go better than what I've probably seen between a 40 and a 50 on early stage. So they address this problem. So if you're early stage, use it. Call your program officer. Program officers are really, really good. They're there to serve you, and it's not hard to find them. You just go into whatever area you're going to apply. If it's NCI for cancer, you can find a program officer that is associated with the grants, and talk to them, learn who they are, discuss your study section summary statements with them. A lot of times they're there when the review goes on, and they can give you a lot of information. Sometimes they'll say, well, you know, your R01 didn't go well, but they thought it would be a great R21 and they hope you'll resubmit it. They can tell you such a thing. So get to know those people. And if you're early stage, use it. And I think that's it. If there's next slide, if there's any questions, happen to answer them.
So as evident in the discussion we just had, Dr. Sens has been a longtime writer and recipient of NIH applications and grant funds, but additionally, he's also been a longtime chair as well.
Hi, Dr. Sens, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure can.
Thank you so much for your talk and giving the details about the process. I was wondering that you said that certainly when a grant doesn't get a score, we better think about a new approach. But what about changing the study section? Have you ever experienced that from one study section to another study section, maybe change the view of the grant? And I'm talking about NCI, for example. I usually send to Monk, but my recent submission, my mentor also said that the Monk become very harsh these days. So I just wanted to know what you think.
Yeah, I have no problem with switching them around. If they'll do it. You can put a cover letter on and say, look, I saw this study section. I think it would be ideal. What it does do is if you request one and it doesn't go real well, they can say to you, well, maybe you should have listened to us and put it where we said. But it's not a bad deal. Is what's really nice is if you can get it arranged so even if you had a high score or even if you were triaged, to send the triage one back or the high score back to one study section and put a new one into another, but they got to be different grants. And that way you can get off a cycle. I did a lot of that when I was younger. In other words, I'd submit anything that moved. And the one thing in the NIH is what pays off is persistence. Okay, I've had grants my whole life, and the ones I got funded weren't any better than the ones that got turned down. It's just, you just got to keep trying. And if you try and publish and keep publishing, eventually you'll hit one.
Okay.
And don't ignore RFAs. Every once in a while, an RFA will come out that fits you perfectly.
Exactly.
And I think everybody knows, and I should have put it on a slide, I'm sorry I didn't, is there's a site where the NIH puts out their funding opportunities every Friday. And you can sign up for it, it'll hit your mailbox or your email. It gives you anything that's changed about the review process, RFAs, PARs, the whole business. And so if you don't have that, you need to get it. Your research offices should be able to tell you exactly how to do the NIH guide, it's called.
Yeah, we receive every Friday. The dean of the school sent to us. Yes.
Yeah, you gotta request it. It's amazing the number of people that don't get it. So I'm glad you got it.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Sens, yeah, thank you for the introduction of the process. And I've been actually encountering a different set of problem that even before I get a score, I am encountering problems like my applications was withdrawn by the PO because they say that it doesn't fit the institute mission very well, or something like that. And because I just started a year ago, and I have fairly limited data in a few different directions, and in that I think when I try to either submit to those opportunities that doesn't require preliminary data for the opportunity just for early investigators, or I try to put things the available data together, and sometimes it doesn't fit perfectly in one institute's mission. But in that case, how can I tweak it? I try to talk to PO, but the fact is like they can offer some suggestions, but it's hard for me to put something that sometimes perfectly fits one institute's mission.
So is what I would suggest you do, instead of even trying to do the institute, I would go into, you can search for study sections. and it will give you all the study sections that are in the NIH. And at the top of that list of the study sections for each one, they give you their mission and what they're looking for. I mean, there's about 100 of these.
Right.
And, you know, so you could have something that's an environmental agent in cancer, for example, and it may be of interest to NIEHS, which is the National Institute of Environmental Health Science, and it may also be interested with the cancer, and they have the ability to dual appoint that one. So I would go into those study sections and try to match what my expertise is to the study section.
Okay.
Okay, and once I got that study section, then I'd start going for the program officers or the SROs. I think the SROs are listed there. So your scientific review officer is what really runs the study section. And after the review, it goes to the program officer. So both of them are valuable. And if you don't have much preliminary data, you're probably down there getting more in the R21 category. And Christian's given a number of these on R21s on how to write them. But even though they'll say they don't want preliminary data, it's hard to do a grant with none.
Right.
Okay.
I think,
and, you know, at least on an R21, your page numbers are down. So it's not such a striking omission.
Right. I don't need as much feeler, basically.
Yeah. And if you have trouble locating an institute or something, you know, you can talk to me and send me your topics. And also, I imagine you're in a COBRA, a CTR, something. And you can always go to the IDEA program or the CTR program here and get advice on this type of thing from other people other than just me. And we can actually get you with some people, I would think, in general medicine that could give you some advice on how to do this.
Right.
Christian's pretty good at this, so.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I'm not that familiar with study sections, so never thought about the starting from the study section instead of starting from the institute. And so that's what my impression is with, sorry, taking a little bit more time.
It's all right.
It's about the NIGMS. It's like, I thought it covers quite a wide spectrum of things, but the fact is I just received a letter that my application was withdrawn because they don't, the PO there don't think it fits their mission, but it's like it's like the FOA, but only with NIGMS. So they said they can refer me to another institute, and this is just like a month or so after submission. So it's like basically it's administrative withdrawn at the very beginning screening stage.
Yes. And I don't know you.
Right.
So is your research more biomedical, or does it cross over into the National Science Foundation?
Yeah, that's a tough part. I'm doing more like technology development, genetic engineering, synthetic biology for regenerative medicine, but it's like kind of a cross between engineering and medicine.
The people here at UND, I don't know about the other schools, they've had pretty good luck with career development awards from NSF. Okay. And it's a whole different type of grant writing, but it's a different format. But NSF, if you're out of the biomedical where they're starting to holler about that, you want to look at NSF. Okay. And if you need to talk to somebody about NSF, give Christian a holler, and I can give him a name of somebody here who would probably help you out that's had career development awards.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
And if there are no further questions, I'd like to remind our audience that the Dakota hosts these webinars every month, except for the month of December. We'll be taking that month off, but we'll be live again in January. If you have suggestions for an upcoming webinar, feel free to let us know. Otherwise, these slides and this recording will be available on Pathfinder, where you can refer to them later. Other than that, I wish everyone a happy Taco Tuesday and all the best good scores. And thanks to Dr.
Fantastic.
Sens for taking time to be with us today.
Take care.